Hello, welcome to Legacy of Kain Blood Omen. This is the first game of 5 in this series, and I absolutely love this series. I recommend it to everybody. I really want to share this story because of how much I enjoy it, and a lot of people out there can't play the games for whatever reason. So that's the point of this video. So there will of course be spoilers. I'll be trying to tell the entirety of the story. I'll be relatively thorough, though I will attempt to avoid spoiling future tiles until I've made those respective videos. So let's go ahead and get into it, and I really hope everybody enjoys. So the game starts us off, and we're looking at this text that's talking about how there are machinations in place and the world will soon be bathed in blood and stuff like that. We're then shown a war zone, showing that this upcoming scene takes place during the time of the Seraphans, centuries before the actual events of the game, but we'll get into that later. We come to an indoor scene, and we see a vampire who we later learn is named Vorador, and he's attacking a group of people who we later learn are Pillar Guardians. They're calling for their defender Malik, who doesn't make it in time, and Vorador ends up killing a few of these guardians. We then see that Malik is getting punished by another Circle Guardian, Mortanius. He punishes him by essentially taking his skin away and binding his soul to armor. We then jump to another scene, and this one's focused on Ariel, Guardian of the Pillar of Balance, and she's getting murdered by somebody mysterious, and this happens sometime later after the previous scene. And we then get a quick look at the pillars starting to decay. We then jump to Kain, the character we play in the game, and he says he's a noble from Kurhagen. He just wants a drink, but the barkeeper says it's too late and it gets pretty dangerous at night, and Kain says, okay, and he leaves. Just outside, and quite suddenly, there's a handful of thugs that point Kain out and start attacking him. Now you as the player can fight them off and maybe kill one or two, but in the end Kain dies and that's it. Story's over. But then we jump to Kain in some kind of hellish location, and the only thing that's on his mind is vengeance. And then the necromancer Mortanius pops up, we've met him once already, and says, Kain, I can offer you the vengeance you're looking for. And Kain admits he kind of jumped on this opportunity rather quickly, but he accepts, and becomes a vampire and is just ready to commit some murders. And then Kain wakes up inside his own mausoleum, meaning enough time has passed for him to have been entombed. And soon after, we get some seemingly random exposition about an artifact known as the Heart of Darkness. Kain says the heart belonged to the legendary Janos Audrin, a very powerful vampire, but was eventually ripped, still beating from his chest. Now throughout the game you do find several Hearts of Darkness that do act as restoratives for Kain, but in the story there really is only literally one Heart of Darkness. And there's a story-based reason as to why it's a lifeline for Kain, so to speak. Moving on, Kain leaves his mausoleum and finds that the sun is very uncomfortable and the rain burns like acid. And learning a little more about vampires, we find that there really is no concept of holy water in this story, but rather all water burns vampires like acid. The sun is interesting. We learn some more details about it in a future game, which I will say now. The sun would normally be lethal to fledgling vampires, and powerful elders are merely weakened by the sun. But even without a lot of these details, it is still pretty clear that Kain is quite powerful for even a new vampire. Once leaving the graveyard, Kain immediately runs into the assassins that murdered him. And it seems pretty convenient, but it is conceivable that somebody might have arranged for them to be there to be killed by Kain, which he does proceed to do. After which Kain's journey is over. He even says so himself.
My quest was over.
But then, just as Kain is finishing up, the disembodied voice of Mortanius, which sounds strangely like a beloved child psychologist, tells Kain that his quest is not quite over because those assassins were merely the instrument of his death and not the cause, and that he should now go towards the Pillars of Nosgoth, which we'll get to learn a little bit more about them, and then after that go to the Fortress of the Mind. So Kain moves onward to the town Ziegsterl, and he makes a note that this is the town where he got murdered. And you notice that Kain looks very much like a vampire, and a lot of people attack him on sight. And some people ignore him, try not to get into any trouble, but he currently can't hide the fact that he is a vampire. And as he's passing through and after he's finished, he mentions that he was hasty in Mortanius' offer, and he didn't really question Mortanius' motives, and so he kind of hoped to get some answers at the pillars. And Kain even makes a note of how the pillars are still grand and beautiful, despite Nosgoth's current state of decay. Then Kain finally arrives at the pillars of Nosgoth, and he meets Ariel. And at first Kain is like, whoa, a ghost, stay back or I'll stab ya. And Ariel responds with, "I'm a ghost, you can't really hurt me anyway, and the worst I can do to you is haunt you for thousands of years, but really only if you hang out right here, and that's not really going to be a problem, is it?" And then Cain says, "What? No, I'm just looking for a cure." To which Ariel says, dude, you're dead, you can't, there's no cure for that. But guess what? You can help save the world. And she goes on to explain how she was one of the Circle Guardians herself. She was the Balance Guardian. And when she was murdered, her husband, Nupraptor, who is the guardian of the Pillar of the Mind, suspected that there was treachery among the Circle, and so he spread a madness to all the other Circle Guardians, which corrupted them, and it also corrupted their respective pillars, which reflects on the world Nosgoth, and is a big reason why the world is starting to decay right now. So Cain says, "Well, honestly, I don't really care about the world. It can rot for all I care." But Ariel says, "Well, why don't you go ahead and kill every one of the Circle Guardians anyway, bring each of their tokens back to the pillars to restore them, and you'll get some answers, just don't read into it." So Cain's like, "Okay," and off he goes. Now, as Kane's moving along with his travels, he's starting to get a grasp of his abilities and starting to learn new ones, and there are quite a few that come up here that recur through the rest of the Legacy of Kain series, such as his bat form, which is his main mode of transportation. His sanctuary ability kind of suggests that he has limited teleportation. His mist form he largely uses for infiltrating and stealth, as well as a few other abilities that collectively entail things like mind control and telekinesis. And then, of course, many other abilities that come up just in Blood Omen 1 that you use a lot here but never show up again, like Wolf Form. And Kane's moving onward with his adventure, and he starts coming through some more towns that are scattered throughout Nosgoth. And the next one he comes across is Noctulm, which he says is just an average country village that's plagued with some brigands, and he kills some people. And then he comes across the village Stench and Crow, and he says it's a stinky village that he wouldn't have graced with his presence in life. And then he kills some people. But while he's in Stench and Crow, he comes across a guy who he describes as a lunatic, and he empathizes with Cain as an outsider and just kind of foreshadowed Cain getting the disguise ability in the near future. Then Cain moves onward further to another town called Wasserbund, and it's there that he does learn to disguise himself as just a regular old peasant. And all Cain really has to say about Wasserbund is that its glory is now stained, so I suppose it was once a more prominent village, but now with the decay of Nosgoth has become more crappy. And Cain also really notes that the only thing notable about Wasserbund now is that it rests at the foot of Nopraptor's Retreat, which is the fortress of the mind that Mortanius referred to earlier. And now that Cain can disguise himself as a peasant, he can talk to people now, and some of them mention that traders normally come in from Avernus Cathedral, but they haven't arrived yet. And so Cain moves onwards, not necessarily killing people this time. Now, the townspeople and the guards start mentioning other things to Cain as he's talking to them, and they say that they're not fond of Nopraptor's presence, that his magic creeps them out and stuff like that, and they say they don't want to deal with him, but Cain mentions that pilgrims once came to Nopraptor's retreat and sought wisdom from him. But now you kind of get the notion that bad stuff tends to happen to anybody who visits him nowadays. Then Cain makes his way to the retreat, he gets inside, and on his way through he comes across a handmaiden who kind of expands on some of the information we already know about Nopraptor, such as how he just went nuts after his wife Ariel died, and how he sewed his mouth and eyes shut to close himself off from the world, then turned his madness on the Circle, causing the corruption that we're now dealing with. Then Cain goes further up the retreat, and as he's getting closer to the top he comes across the eye socket portion of the structure, and he looks through them, and out of the right eye socket, he sees through a window just a regular planescape of Nosgoth, and it just looks normal. So he goes over to the other one, and when he looks through it, Nosgoth looks desolate and destroyed, and Cain makes a note that Nosgoth didn't need a lens to warp and taint its image in order to show its corruption. Then Cain makes his way further up the keep, and both he and Malik come face to face with Nopraptor at the same time. And of course, Malik's there to defend the Circle members like he promised to do, but before he can even get a word in, Nopraptor's like, "Hey Malik, I don't want you to get your failure all over my nice clean floors." And he tells him to leave, so Malik leaves. So Napraptor challenges Kain to combat, and Kain just wins and cuts his head off. Kain then brings the head of her beloved back to Ariel, rested at the foot of the Pillar of the Mind, which then restores it. And now that Kain has met Malik, he decides that Malik, being the defender of the circle, should probably be the next one Kain confronts. So as Kain's moving north past Vasterbund, he makes mention of a plague that started in eastern villages and nobody was prepared for. And Kain finally gets back to Courhagen, his hometown that he mentioned from the beginning. Kain says that Courhagen is the finest city in Nosgoth, but it's rich in vanity and deceit. And that plague is now here, in Courhagen. And I believe that's the main reason the game doesn't really mention Kain's friends or family or anything, because the plague probably took them, because it's just an absolute mess here, a complete disaster. After Kain makes his way through Courhagen, he scales the mountains north of the town to get himself a better vantage point, and from there he finds Malik's bastion tucked away in the mountains to the southeast. So Kain flies there, and he heads inside, and he immediately notices that Malik's subordinates, defenders of his bastion, are not unlike him, their fleshless animated armor. And as Kain's making his way through this keep, he's finding machines that are infusing the souls of long dead warriors to armor, and so Kain smash. Then as Kain's passing onward to the intersection, he notes how not very vampire friendly this place is. The snow disperses the sun, making it so much worse, and there's almost no blood in sight. But Kain pushes onward, and he sees the eerie image of Malik's corpse and former body sitting atop a throne. Kain and Malik exchange words about it. Kain moves past it and moves to actually confront Malik. So they come face to face, and Kain can actually hold his own against Malik. He's not having much of a problem fighting him, but he quickly discovers that he can't really destroy Malik's armor and thus can't defeat him, so he has to retreat. So he returns to Ariel, of course, his most reliable source of information. And all Ariel tells Kain is to go visit the Oracle, who is in a network of caverns east of Malik's bastion. So Kain heads that way, easily finds the caverns, and while he's navigating them, he comes across a few items. One of them is a book that talks about the Seraphan and how they were started in response to the undead scourge. They're referring to vampires. And the Seraphan were very good at exterminating vampires and were led to many victories by the Paladin and our good friend Malik. Then Kain moves onward and meets the Oracle, who's acting very coy and not much is very clear about him, and he immediately starts talking about how King Otmar is the primary force who opposes the legions of the Nemesis. And yes, this is the first we're hearing about all this stuff, and it'll come up again later. But King Otmar is unable to act because he's very concerned about his daughter who has fallen mysteriously ill. So Kain says, I don't care about whatever you're talking about, I'm here to learn about Malik, tell me how to defeat him. So the Oracle goes, okay, and tells Kain about how Malik is the last of the Seraphan, and he then explains the events of the very first cutscene we watched, which this would be the first opportunity the audience would have to learn most of this information. So this would be the first we've heard Vorador's name, and we talk about how he killed the Circle members, and how Malik was punished, and how Malik has not let a single Circle member fall since the incident, except of course now Nupraptor. So the Oracle tells Kain to go visit Vorador in Termagant Forest, and Kain heads that way. While Kain is headed towards Vorador, it becomes apparent that his mansion is located in the middle of a swamp, and Kain wonders why that is, considering all this water is very hazardous to vampires. I believe that's probably because this weakness to water is common knowledge in Nosgoth, and most people wouldn't think to look in a swamp for a vampire. When Kain gets inside the mansion, he realizes that all the people, the staff, are vampires themselves. They're Vorador spawn, so to speak. Inside the mansion, Kain comes across a couple of pantries containing living humans, which kind of illustrates how humans really are just no more than cattle here. And further in, Kain comes across another book, similar to the one he found in the Oracle's cave, discussing the rise of the Seraphan. It says their war was perhaps triggered by an excessive rise in population among the vampires. And between Vorador's book and some tapestries he has, vampires are painted in more of a victimized light, with images of them actually being burned and decimated. Then Kain meets Vorador, and the first thing he mentions is that he's quite stunned by Vorador's appearance. He's a little concerned about ending up so monstrous himself. But Vorador is quite friendly towards Kain, unlike his staff, and offers Kain a drink to indulge his gift. And this shocks Kain quite a bit because, despite his power, he's viewed undeath as quite the curse so far. Vorador talks about how he views vampires as gods among the human cattle, and then starts bragging about his fight with Malik. We get to hear about this story again. He says he attacked the Circle like this because they started this holy war against vampires, and he ended up killing 6 of their members, actually. Vorador says he since has not meddled in the affairs of humans for any reason other than to feed. Vorador says he doesn't want Kain going after Malik because a Seraphan hunt is more trouble than it's worth. But then he says, hey, you're young and I like you, and I just know you're gonna get into trouble, so take my ring and use it to call me if and when that trouble happens. Kain takes his leave, but now he says his resolve is strengthened because he thinks Vorador has become soft and lazy over the years. So it's about time now for Mortanius to chime in, which he does. He says there are 3 people to the north who are plotting to twist the world, and Kain can even see it happening from where he's standing. So Kain progresses through another village. This one's called Ushtenheim. Kain notes that this is where the vampire Janos Audrin used to hang out and where he was killed. And talking to a lot of the townspeople, they still mention Janos Audrin. There are a lot of myths circulating about him, and it's safe to assume that a lot of them are not true, as Janos Audrin's time was so long ago. Then as Kain's moving outward from Ushtenheim, he starts seeing some very strange creatures, which he notes are, or were, humans that have been in Dark Eden, the strange twisted place where Kain is headed. And it's not just humans either, there are twisted hybrids of all manners of creatures like bugs and other animals. And Kain admits that despite their sickening appearance, he admired the ingenuity behind their creation. Kain then says that if a land could be said to have descended into madness, then that's what's going on in Dark Eden. It was perverting all elements of nature, and worse yet, it was spreading. And Kain then actually passes through the barrier into Dark Eden and is unaffected, as apparently Dark Eden only affects living matter, and Kain's vampirism apparently twists him enough as it is. He gets to the tower, which is emitting this corrupting aura, and inside it's like a TARDIS situation. It's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, which Kain says is possible through the various magics at the Circle's disposal. While exploring, Kain encounters a magic laboratory, and he identifies that there are several different types of magic at work here, which was unusual because apparently it's rare for different types of sorcerers to work together, even among Circle members. At the heart of the tower, we get introduced to 3 new Circle members. We have Bane the Druid, who is Guardian of the Pillar of Nature, Dujul the Energist, Guardian of the Pillar of Energy, and Anacroth the Alchemist, Guardian of the Pillar of States. And this is the first time anyone calls Kain the Scourge of the Circle, and that title's really gonna stick, and he shares it with Vorador. Now, Bane and Dujul are pretty eager to fight Kain, Bane saying that Kain is an affront to nature, which is just a little insight into the madness that affects him, considering the fact that they're creating Dark Eden. But Anacroth is the smart one. He's like, no, 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 no. Malik, wherever you are, get your butt here right now. Malik shows up, and Anacroth just bolts. So Kain responds by using the ring that Vorador gave to him. So Vorador shows up, and he and Malik both seem pretty eager for a rematch. They go head to head, the other 2 wizards flee into the other room, and Kain pursues them. Kain, of course, comes out on top, wins, and collects Dujul's cloak and Bane's antler headdress. He returns to the previous room and finds that Vorador has already left and that Malik is dead. Kain proceeds to pick up Malik's helmet, as he was a Circle Guardian as well. Kain returns to the pillars, puts Dujul's cloak at the foot of the Pillar of Energy, Bane's antler headdress at the foot of the Pillar of Nature, and Malik's helmet at the foot of the Pillar of Conflict, restoring all 3. So now Ariel says to go seek Azimuth the Planer, who's in Avernus Cathedral, and there are some tools there that Kain also needs to acquire. And when Kain sees Avernus off in the distance, he sees it in flames. He says it consumed itself before his very eyes. And he approaches the outskirts of the city and sees some villagers. And while they don't quite look like it, and a lot of them don't really sound like it, I do believe that they are running away from Avernus. And Kain gets inside the city of Avernus, and there are a bunch of soldiers here. This place is under attack. We begin to see more damage and casualties the closer we get to the center of the city. We also see that it's a bunch of demons and otherworldly beasts that are attacking. And Cain makes it to the cathedral, and it's untouched because this is where the demons are coming from. And it's a pretty run-of-the-mill cathedral that would be quite lovely. It's got stuff like stained glass depicting things like Vorador's fight with Malik, but much more importantly, this is where Cain finds the Soul Reaver. Cain says the origin of the Soul Reaver has been largely lost, but nonetheless it is still definitely a soul-consuming blade, and he says he feels a kinship with it. Soon after, Cain meets Azimuth, guardian of the Pillar of Dimensions, and matriarch of the cathedral. She says she didn't know that the Reaver was here and she wants it for herself, but whatever. And we learn that she's been using her planar magic to summon demons and she's been attacking the city of Avernus from here. So Cain of course slays her, the Soul Reaver making it especially easy. And he collects her third eye, which might be a literal eye, but she carries it with her, it's not attached to her. Then on his way out, Cain collects a portable time streaming device. And while it's never really specifically said, this one's unique in that most time streaming devices are definitely not portable. He returns to the pillars and uses the third eye to restore the Pillar of Dimension. Ariel then explains that the time streaming device belongs to Mobius and that Azimuth took it for herself so that she could add creatures from other points in time to her crazy little army. And now we finally get to hear about the nemesis that the Oracle referred to earlier. Ariel says he was once known as William the Just, and he was a very great leader. But as he gained more power, he also gained more evilness, and started taking surrounding territories by force. She tells Cain he needs to rally the forces of Willendorf and fight back against him. Now Cain comes to admit that he knows he's working off some vague advice. But without much to work on, he pushes forward and hears from Mortanius again, who says he knows he has to face his death, and that he can no longer help Cain from this point forward. Regardless, once Willendorf is within view, Cain mentions that the Lion Throne once held Cain's, and by extension Corhagen's, allegiance. Cain comments on how Willendorf is prosperous because it's in a location where it can mine a lot of metals and unearth a lot of tombs. And one such secret enables Cain to better disguise himself so that he looks like his former noble self rather than just a peasant. Cain makes it to the outer town area, and it's quite a nice city. It's quite refreshing to see in Nosgoth, but the people here are all still quite frightened because of the whole Nemesis situation. In the inner city, there's a nice library, and inside, Cain finds an interesting book, which says a new guardian for a pillar is eventually chosen to replace one should they happen to die. And this information should answer some questions, but possibly raise new ones. Regardless, Cain strolls into the main hall of the castle in Willendorf and politely asks for an audience, and this guy kindly steps aside. We talk to King Otmar, and he says he's sad because he celebrated his daughter's birthday with a contest for making dolls. And the guy that won requested a lock of the princess's hair, which he then apparently used to curse her with sleepy time. King Otmar's forces are spread thin looking for this doll maker, so Cain decides to help to get the army in order. Cain then heads northward and runs through one more town called Stahlberg. He says this was once a center for learning and intellect, but now the Nemesis' forces have attacked and ruined everything. Cain pushes further into the Nemesis territory and makes it to the dollmaker's house, which is pretty deep in. We find the dollmaker, and it turns out he's an old man named Elzevir who put the princess' soul into a doll, but the reason why still remains a mystery, as Cain kills him and cuts his head off, and goes back to Willendorf to present the head and the doll to King Otmar. Otmar is of course very happy, as he has sorcerers who can put the princess' soul where it belongs, and offers Cain his whole kingdom as thanks, but Cain says, "I don't want your kingdom, I just want your army." King Otmar is ready and willing to go to war, and suddenly we're on the battlefield. Pretty soon in, Cain mentions that the Nemesis forces are so overwhelming, and it's really not terribly long before King Otmar falls on the battlefield. At the sight of the death of their king, the soldiers flee into the forest, and Cain is pushed northward. It's then that he activates his time-streaming device, not really knowing what he's doing. Cain is spirited away into another time in the same place where there's no battle occurring, and of course the device breaks, leaving him stranded for the time being. He learns pretty soon that whatever time he's in, it was not long before his arrival here that the Oracle that he had met not long before was here as well, and rallying a lot of villagers to seem to want to fight and requesting to speak to the king. Kain passes through Stahlberg once more, and it's much more lively now, and people are bragging about their king, William the Just. Kain realizes from his surroundings that he's gone about half a century, 50 years back into the past. And so he takes the opportunity to go into King William's stronghold to try to stop the would-be nemesis. We come to listen in on the Oracle talking to King William, and we learn that the Oracle is in fact Mobius the Time Streamer, guardian of the Pillar of Time. And it's apparent that Mobius has been manipulating and equipping King William and his forces, and he even warns him that a vampire is coming to kill him. Kain then finds King William, who's expecting him, and they fight each other. But apparently King William also has the Soul Reaver thanks to Mobius. Kain still defeats King William, and for now note how King William's Soul Reaver breaks close to the end of the blade. But anyway, Kain finds a nearby, conveniently placed time streaming device that while it's not really said either way, this one could be portable, but I think it's actually the room Kain's standing in. It's irrelevant as Kain uses it right away, returns to his own time, and rather than war, there are mobs and hunters. And he walks out of the stronghold to the sound of screams and the smell of vampire blood. We learn that people all across Nosgoth have been very busy over the past 50 years killing a lot of vampires, not unlike the Seraphan used to do. And of course it's because some vampire came along and assassinated their great king, William the Just. Kain comes upon an execution gathering, which is of course being led by Mobius. They have Vorador and they behead him, and then Mobius points out Kain and tells everybody that he's the last remaining vampire. Kain then finds himself wondering how much of his journey has been by Mobius's design, and what could it possibly have all been leading towards. Kain ends up beheading Mobius and takes his hourglass. Afterward, Mortanius then calls Kain back to the Pillars. Kain arrives at the Pillars to see that Mortanius and Anacroth are arguing. Anacroth says he knows that Mortanius had Kain killed and then raised in order to scourge the Circle. Mortanius says that this had to be done and that the Circle had failed in their duties. Anacroth disagrees and says the Guardians were given their power to do it as they please. Mortanius then kills Anacroth and Kain emerges. Mortanius is prepared for death but says one Guardian will remain. As Mortanius is being killed, he transforms into a creature. Now this creature is an Unspoken that has been possessing Mortanius. Up until now, Unspoken have only been mentioned offhandedly a couple of times. But despite this, they're still very significant in the entirety of this series. This thing tells Kain that he's served him well, and that all of this was just the first act of a grand theater. Kain does still kill it, and proceeds to use Anacross Scales, Mortanius' Death Orb, and Mobius' Hourglass to restore the state's Death and Time Pillars respectively. And then Ariel drops a bombshell on Kain, telling him that he is her replacement as the Balance Guardian, and that he has been afflicted with the madness as well, and must either sacrifice himself, saving Nosgoth, but now ensuring the extinction of vampires thanks to Mobius, or refuse, throwing everything out of balance, destroying everything we've worked for so far. Now, as the player, you can choose to go through with the sacrifice, but no, we need a happy ending. Kain in fact refuses the sacrifice and comes to rule a crumbling empire, and lives happily ever after.
What madness is this?